Hello and welcome to a very special episode of the Ocean News podcast, an audio series in which we usually take a deeper dive into one story from the day's biggest headlines from the oceanographic newsroom. But today, and as we approach the third ever United Nations Oceans Conference in Nice next week, we're diving into deep conversation instead. And we're diving into those conversations with some key players from across the ocean sector. And they don't get much more prestigious than today's guest. I'm Rob Hutchins, editor here at Oceanographic Magazine, and yes, today I am talking to a name revered across the ocean exploration space. Consider this a brush with ocean royalty, as today we sit down for a deep conversation with none other than Alexandra Cousteau, a senior advisor to Oceana in the US, a founder of Oceans 2050, and of course the granddaughter and daughter of the incredibly renowned Jacques and Philippe Cousteau. Alexandra, thanks so much for joining us and chatting with me for the Ocean News podcast. It's a real pleasure. Actually, it's a real pleasure to meet you. You're here in London today representing Oceana this week, which, if my calculations are correct, you've been acting as senior advisor to for the past, was it 14 years? Which should take us back to, quick maths, 2011.
2011. Yeah. So
can you just start off, actually, how did this all come about for you?
how did that happen? It's a really interesting story. Andy Sharpless called me, Andy Sharpless is former CEO who just retired. But he sent me an email out of the blue. I didn't even know who Andy Sharpless was, inviting me to meet him at the office. And okay. And so I went to meet him, curious about what he was going to have to say to me. And he invited me to be a senior advisor for the organization. So it's been fantastic because I get to spend about a little less than a month a year supporting the team in all the different offices. You know, my sort of mandate is to just be helpful in whatever way I can be to all the different country offices. And so it's been fantastic. I've gotten to work with the U.S. office, the Belizean, the Mexican, the Canadian, the Filipino, the Europeans. So it's been fantastic. And I think the thing that's exciting for me about Oceana is just the track record of victories and the way that they work so strategically and really looking at outcomes instead of programs. It's a huge difference. And it's just a really cool bunch of people.
Yeah. Do you know what? They are a very cool bunch of people who do some very cool and amazing things. So 14 years, that's a nice amount of time to have got some pretty cool achievements under your own belt yourself. Looking back then over those 14 years, what have been some of your proudest moments working with the team at Oceana?
One of my proudest moments was when I was able to go down and support the Belizean team on getting the moratorium on oil and gas in Belize's waters. Because they were actually considering bringing oil and gas into a UNESCO World Heritage Site. I played a tiny part, but it was an amazing campaign, and just to see the team working on it and their strategy and their creativity and the victory, right? And they just keep hammering that home. So that was a really fun one. And I've supported the Philippines when they were just opening Oceana there. I went for 3 weeks and visited all the communities and all the decision makers. And we just went all over the place doing that and kind of doing a lot of press and storytelling. And that was super exciting as well, just to see. There's this one woman. I was kind of meeting all these stakeholder groups and giving talks and stuff. And at one university, Oceana was giving a prize out. What is it called? Like the Ocean Hero Prize. And it was to this woman whose husband would patrol the beach and report illegal fishing activities in his province. And he was all night long. And he was murdered by the illegal fisherman. So his wife took his place. His widow took his place. And she's this tiny little old lady. But the courage and the determination and to patrol the beaches that got her husband murdered, those stories are, especially those stories about women, are undertold. They're not. It was just this amazing example of people who have nothing but will give everything to save the oceans. Yeah.
Wow. I mean, wow. What a tragic story, but actually, what an uplifting one in a show of resilience on the part of this woman, and what a show of actually, as you say, courage, and I guess ultimately hope more than anything. That against the odds, or rather, despite life's tragedies, the connection to the ocean is something so visceral that it can bring people that level of support or galvanize that hope. What then, whether it's stories like this or something else you've witnessed, what gives you hope when you're in this, when you're immersed in this area?
Yeah, I think you have ups and downs in this work, as you know, right? I think we all at this table feel the same ups and the same downs. And um, when I look at it from sort of a generational perspective, because I do think about that a lot, when my grandfather started and the oceans were so abundant, and the films and the stories that he told of that abundance is what gave people this awe for the ocean and made them want to become marine biologists and want to save it and want to support legislation and policies that wanted to start ocean-friendly companies or sustainable seafood. Like, it all came from this conservation ethic that my father helped to champion in the 1970s. And since that time, we've lost half the life in the ocean. And it's just that's that's hard, But at the same time, science tells us that we can restore it. We can rebuild it. It's what Oceana is working on. It's and that narrative of going from conservation, where you protect what's left, and when you have lost half of something, like, that's kind of insufficient ambition, I think, to rebuilding what you've lost. I think it's not only important for those of us who work in the field and who are kind of on the front lines of those disappointments and those heartbreaks, but it's also important for the general public, for them to feel like it's not already lost, that there's still things that we can do. There's reasons for hope and optimism, that if they take action, it actually matters. Because it's very possible that my children could be the generation of my family that writes the obituary for the world's oceans, right? In just 4 generations, in just 100 years, to go from abundance to complete collapse. But that doesn't have to be that way, right? And so it's the fact that we still have that possibility to change the outcome that is exciting to me. And so I choose to look at the stories that we have of resilience and victories and positive outcomes and communities like this woman and so many others like her that I've met around the world who are fighting alongside us, even if we don't know that they're there. So we're not alone. And I think there's millions of us who share this dream of more abundant, resilient oceans. And the ending hasn't been written yet.
No, the ending definitely hasn't been written yet. Not while we're all still here telling it. But the story has perhaps evolved. So how have you seen the narrative evolve among public over the years since the start of your work with Oceana to now? How have you seen that change in the zeitgeist of people and culture?
It's interesting. Like, from the time I was a teenager talking with people to now, there's been an evolution. I think there are 2 tracks. One is how many people remember my grandfather. So that number has definitely dipped, which is unfortunate, but there you go. And then what people care about. And so 25 years ago, 30 years ago, when I was doing DEMA and I was like going to these different places, people were still kind of caught up in exploration and conservation. Like, let's protect what we have. And I guess it made sense back then because we had a lot more than we have now. And there was still kind of like a negativity to the narrative, right? There's a lot of guilt, a lot of shame, a lot of kind of morality-based narrative about how this is the right thing to do, saving the ocean, it has intrinsic value. And where we've gone now is more people really want to talk about what we can do, not what we've lost. And so there's much more emphasis on solutions. The restoration idea has really, I think, when I started talking about it in 2018, nobody was talking about it, but now you see it everywhere, and you see it even in COP biodiversity conference in Montreal. It was like restoration was finally on the docket, which is exciting, right? Because it's a completely different approach from how you do your science, what you look at. It's a different approach to getting your KPIs, and Oceana was one of the first really to change their narrative as well, to really look at rebuilding and restoration and livelihoods and people. And you can't divorce the oceans and the well-being of communities. Like, they have to go hand in hand. If you only care about the oceans and you don't care about people, and we're not gonna create a win-win solution that everybody can feel invested in. So I think that's another thing that I really love about Oceana's approach is that it incorporates people into the solution.
Yeah, absolutely. And by making making everyone a part of the same conversation.
Yeah, and the other thing that's been interesting is in all of my speaking engagements and my conversations that I have where I talk about how it's not too late, there's still so much that we can do. There's all these new, like, there's Save the Oceans, Feed the World, there's all these new technologies, there's new kinds of, multilateral agreements like 30 by 30, restore the oceans, restore our land. The people that I'm talking to are like, "Oh my God, I love your hopeful narrative. I love that you're focused on like solutions." And of course they are, right? Like, they don't want to, no one, I don't watch the depressing documentaries either. Like, I know it. I don't need to see it.
Yeah.
Like, I know it, right?
Yeah.
I don't want to spend an evening just wanting to throw myself out a window. But then there's documentaries that tell us what we can do about it.
Yeah. Sure.
And that's exciting. And like, let's talk about how to fix this. And that's where I think you get people to come on board. And I think also when the science right now that's allowing us to start quantifying the value of nature, whether it's fisheries, whether it's carbon, biodiversity, like whatever it is, that it gives additional stakeholders an opportunity to get engaged. We didn't have that before, right? The ocean space was really marine biologists. That was about it. Maybe some explorers and photographers, but there was nobody else. Whereas we need data scientists and artists and lawyers, and like we need investors, and need everybody to feel like they can be part of this. And so this new approach of rebuilding, the new tools that are being developed, is starting to create new entry points for new individuals to feel like they can contribute and they can benefit.
Okay. Well, I think we're in danger of being quite optimistic here and painting a very optimistic picture. And that's actually a real privilege that we're in a time where there is a lot to be optimistic about. But also, I don't think we can avoid the elephant in the room right now. A lot of that regarding the current administration in the White House, perhaps, and certain approaches to science that seem to be coming from one camp in particular, and I'm talking about Donald Trump. How are we balancing that anti-science and almost anti-environmentalism rhetoric that is coming from the highest office in the United States right now? And how do you think that is going to shape the narrative over the next couple of years?
I think there's a lot of chaos right now, and it can be scary because you don't know where we're going and you don't know what's going to happen. And there's a lot of work that's been done that's being undone, right? And at the same time, and I know this from personal experience, there's people on the other side, and I put that in air quotes, that have the same values that we do about wanting to have the fish back and wanting to be able to fish and wanting to, but they just coming at it from a totally opposite direction. But there's an opportunity for us to find common ground. And so I think that we need to think about how do we create consensus around the value that these have. The nature-based solutions have economic value. Some people talk about them like real estate, right? Like, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just different vocabulary. But we can still get to good outcomes, or at least I'm hopeful that we can. Time will tell, right? Like how this goes. But I think there were problems that needed to be fixed, right? Like, and I think everybody can agree that there were problems that needed to be fixed. But I think this probably wasn't the way I would have fixed it, just by slashing and burning and taking a chainsaw. But that doesn't mean that we can't get there eventually.
Yeah, I actually agree with that. Yeah, completely. So it's about approaching the same issues from different perspectives to be able to embrace everyone in that same conversation. Perhaps less of the isolating, more of the encouraging and inclusion through the way we talk.
I mean, that was one of the big things that Oceana, I mean, I think Oceana, you guys did that single-handedly. Like, I didn't see anyone else really going to the lengths that Oceana went to really be present in all those communities and to create consensus around, we don't want oil and gas drilling off our coasts, you know? So I think that, you know, that's a great example of how we need to find consensus, because not everybody who agreed with that was one side or the other. It's like bringing the two sides together to agree about the importance of our coastal lifestyle and our view and our health and our prosperity, and how, you know, it's hard to reconcile oil and gas drilling and oil spills with tourism and fisheries and all the other things that make a community wealthy, you know, and not just financially, economically, but wealthy in terms of being able to continue traditions, cultural traditions. And I remember in Deepwater Horizon spill, I was in 2010, so it was before I started working with Oceana, but in 2010, I went down and I spoke with fishermen who were impacted by the Deepwater Horizon spill, and it was devastating. I mean, these people were fishermen, right? So we might not have seen eye to eye on everything, but they were some of the most, I mean, those were some of the most heartbreaking and heartwarming conversations I've ever had. You know, to see these salt of the earth, kind of multi-generational fishermen sitting there, men who I'm sure do not cry easily, and who are just weeping over the loss of their livelihood, the loss of their what they love to do with their families, with their children, what they learned to do with their fathers and grandfathers. You know, like the pride that they had in what how they earned a living. And you know, they say, you know, we always talk about the breadbasket of the United States, but we're the seafood platter of the United States. No one talks about that, you know.
Yeah, it's interesting the events that push people to see the human side to others that they probably wouldn't have recognized otherwise. So what was that moment like culturally? Was that a bit of a tipping point for the cultural mindset, the Deepwater Horizon spill?
They've done a lot of studies about the social impact of spills like the Exxon Valdez and like the Deepwater Horizon, and it devastates communities. You see like increase in drug abuse and domestic violence and suicides. And that's what happens when we don't take care of our oceans, and we don't, by extension, take care of the people who depend on them. And so, you know, being able to avoid that in all of these other coastal communities, thanks to Oceana's campaigning, is a real accomplishment. Because when it goes wrong, it goes so horribly wrong that communities and individuals and families are just torn apart. And so I think that's where we talk about, like, you know, I want to do oil gas, and I want to protect the oceans. Well, what there's consensus in the middle that our communities need to be happy and healthy and prosperous, and they can't do that if they're polluted with oil. And we've seen how that works out. And how do we find that common ground so that we can agree on some things? And it may not be everything we want, may not be everything they want, but that common ground needs to be ambitious enough to be able to preserve and rebuild and restore the natural resources that we depend on. And when it comes to our oceans, that's our fisheries. It's, you know, clean water that's not been polluted by oil and gas. It's I'd say it now, but climate, you know, that we can survive in. It's all those things, but we all benefit from it. I think what scares me is the breakdown in kind of scientific consensus and being able to have work from the same set of facts.
Right. Well, we've spoken a lot about Oceania and some of the wider, larger, esoteric subjects here. I think we need to dial in and talk about you. So, Wikipedia informs me that you first joined your father and grandfather on an expedition when you were just 4 months old. I won't ask you what memories you have from that because I simply won't believe it. But how old actually were you when you were thrust into this world of ocean exploration?
No, so I accompanied my parents on expedition till I was about 3.5. So that's when my father died. So life became very different after that. Um, but my grandfather, you know, continued to hang out with us when he could and took me diving when I was 7. So that was a real revelation. And I don't know, it's just all I ever thought about doing. It was not, I think what the greatest gift, and I do try to pass this on to my children, even though I try not to make them feel like they're obligated to do oceans. But it was growing up with the example of a sense of purpose, right? The sense of purpose that my grandfather had, that my father had, um, that people in our kind of world, they all had this really strong sense of purpose, and that was I didn't ever realize it, but I was just always searching to maintain that sense of purpose, right? Oceans, I knew it. It had always been part of my life. I was part of that story. Became my purpose, and I feel really fortunate for that, you know. And people often tell me they don't know what their passion is, but I mean, fisheries legislation. When I started first thinking about it, I was like, oh, this is gonna be kind of dry.
Right.
It's fascinating,
Yeah.
And so, you just need to learn about things, and then passion and purpose comes from knowing about something. So it's very hard to know what your passion, your purpose is if you haven't been exposed to it. It's not just gonna come to you out of thin air. Um, the more you know about things, the more interesting they become, right? That's the gift of knowledge.
Okay, well, you've set me up for some really interesting questions there, and I'm sure some really interesting answers. But before we dive into that part of the conversation, can we just stay on the subject of being a Cousteau just for a little bit longer? Just really want to get a sense of what it was like growing up, being surrounded by that level of admiration, I guess, for the Cousteau name.
I mean, as you can imagine, uh, there were some strong personalities. My grandfather, he can't do what he did without having a strong personality. Um, so my father loved working with him, but he also needed to have his own space. And so he, in his own space, started doing a series called Oasis in Space. And he was interviewing Margaret Mead and Carl Sagan and some of the very early thinkers around conservation without it having been necessarily articulated as a philosophy or as, a thing. Um, and at first my grandfather was like, "Pff, yeah, him and his eco stuff, right?" Because he was very much an explorer. He was a spy for the French intelligence, and he was part of the French resistance, and, like, he came out of Second World War. He started doing this stuff in his 40s. He was already very shaped as a human, like, very formed, um, and there was no environmental consciousness because there was no need,
Yeah.
and, before then, and so that was something that they saw over time, and that my father kind of as a younger, kind of next generation person, saw things differently than his father, came from a different place, and started noticing that. And he was a very sensitive person, so he was noticing these changes, and it bothered him. And that's what led him to want to do Oasis in Space and some of the other things. And then my grandfather joined him
Nice.
and kept it moving after he died.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Incredible.
but yeah, it's and sort of my generation is saying, well, we've gotten to a point where conserving isn't enough anymore. We have to rebuild. We'll see when my children are older. Like, that's my hope that we will have rebuilt oceans for their generation, and they won't be there kind of like notarizing all the losses and what will never come back. And I think it also kind of is, those human generations reflect the time in which they were living in the situation in this 100 years is shaping the world, like, from a natural perspective more than, I don't know, any other time that we can, or at least that matters for us, right? Um, and so it's interesting that my family is sort of, the generations have aligned with different phases in
Yeah.
this massive change. And it's scary and hopeful and heartbreaking and, you know, kind of a torturous sometimes, to kind of see from that family perspective. Just
So is there a big weight of expectation that comes with the Cousteau name?
it's so funny. Like, people definitely have preconceived notions, and I remember when I was younger, people asked me, like, "Oh, I saw this fish on a dive. It was like black and white stripes, but with some spots. Do you know what kind of fish that was?" I'd be like, "No, I don't." You know? Or like there's sort of very much people have a
Aren't you an encyclopedia?
yeah, or like, "What, you didn't grow up on Calypso your whole life?" Like, "No, I went to school." Um, but yeah, that's to be expected. I think that's what it goes hand in hand with any kind of public figure or a person who is, descended from that, how there's going to be people have their ideas about what they think it is. Yeah.
Okay, so when did you learn about how fascinating fisheries really were?
Oh, I discovered that with Oceana. Yeah, I wasn't ever really involved in fisheries stuff before I started working uh, with Oceana, which was one of the great gifts of my time with Oceana has been the experiences, but also just new issues to, you know, learn about and understand and advocate for, and it's really like something like fisheries. It just pisses you off when you see the amount of fraud and abuse and devastation that comes from lack of strong policy, right? Like, people suffer, the environment suffers in very real and tangible ways. You have slavery of children, like, it's just awful, you know? So then that knowledge leads to this incredible sense of purpose when we're looking at, these different countries and the policies and the creativity that goes into kind of working around the obstacles.
Ooh, okay. So yeah, creativity. Speaking of which, and in that case, you're not adverse to your own sense of creativity, being the founder of Oceans 2050. Can you tell us about this platform and the work that you do through that channel?
Oceans 2050 started in 2018, 2019. It was after my friend Carlos Duarte, who's one of the leading marine biologists, marine ecologists in the world. He just won the Japan Prize, which is like the Japanese version of the Nobel Peace Prize.
Wow.
And he wrote this paper that you might have seen called Rebuilding Marine Life. And it was a scientific roadmap for rebuilding abundant oceans by 2050. And that was kind of a turning point for me because up until then, there was really this very strong narrative around conservation. And I was just seeing conservation not really working, right? We still had net losses every year, and you have enough of that, you start reaching tipping points, and the restoration narrative just really resonated with me. Like, it was just a fundamental shift because the conservation approach and the restoration approach are fundamentally different. And that was really inspiring to me. And so Oceans 2050, we created it's with the goal of rebuilding oceans by 2050, and we're not going to do it ourselves alone, but that was sort of the mission and purpose. Yeah, so we did our first project was a seaweed study looking at the carbon sequestration potential of seaweed farming around the world. So we had a global cohort of farms, and we just published that in Nature Climate Change. And we're creating a voluntary carbon protocol for seaweed farming. And looking at now, we've got funding to do design carbon optimized seaweed farming operations. To really, his seaweed farming can have it's a hugely underrated nature based solution for climate change.
Yeah.
And for local communities, and especially women are the primary beneficiaries, in addition to the climate and biodiversity. Um, so again, like something I knew nothing about. Um, Lhasa was actually the one who first told me I should look at kelp, and then our chief scientist is the one who kind of coined the blue economy, and he's a seaweed expert among other things, and so we did that. Um, so that's ongoing, and looking at how to build living reefs, and restoration. So not just corals, but how do you create the whole ecosystem? And we're also looking at blue cities. So how do we engage coastal cities around the world to accelerate their planning and projects for climate resilience and the blue economy and coastal regeneration. So that's super interesting as well. Again, something I didn't know that much about, but I'm fascinated by. And it's so not what I expected.
Yeah, wow. Well, it sounds like you've been incredibly busy, and now with the UN Ocean Conference right around the corner and 2030 right around the corner, you're going to become, well, a whole lot busier. What are the next steps for you? What's the next target in the Cousteau crosshairs?
We've got a lot of plans coming up leading up to UNOC. And it's really important to me that UK, France, Spain, like some of these big nations that should do better, start doing better for bottom trawling. So we're figuring out how to apply pressure. France has done a lot of great stuff for the environment. This is a real black eye for my country. So I'd like to see them step up and show leadership on this. I'd like the UK to be a leader on this. I don't think we can expect the US to do much of anything right now until things kind of get into a more stable place. So I think Europe needs to step up right now, because of course it's gonna be hard to get to 30 by 30 if we don't have agreement on the high seas. So
Well, thank you so much, Alexandra, for a really lovely chat, and thank you for sharing so much and for speaking so passionately about the ocean. I'm looking forward to, and I'm sure we'll catch you at UNOC next week. If you'd like to learn more about any of the topics that Alexandra has spoken with us about in this special episode of the Ocean News podcast, check out oceana.org or Alexandra's own foundation, Oceans 2050. Also, while you're having a look around online, make sure you check out the Oceanographic Newsroom and subscribe to our daily dose of ocean news. This has been the Ocean News podcast. I've been Rob Hutchins, and thank you for listening.